Right now we are at one of the most iconic places in all of New York City. The very entrance of Broadway at the very southern tip of the island of Manhattan. This is Bowling Green Park, the oldest park in all of New York City, surrounded by the oldest fence in all of New York City. However, there's not that many remnants of old New York here in the most historic area of New York, at least before 1835. This is one of the very few ones. Bowling Green used to have a huge King George III statue, and it was torn down for the American Revolution. And the park has stayed ever since. But there was a great fire, as we learned about in 1835, that destroyed most of the historic buildings in this area. And that's why you see all these more modern Greek Revival style buildings that were built in the late 1800s, as we can see right in front of us. But right now, I'm going to take you on the 360 tour journey through Stone Street, which is probably one of the most beautiful streets in this area of New York City. Also the oldest street in all of America. Let's take a walk through and show you that beautiful street. Right in front of us, we have the U.S. Customs House.
So we're here at the station's already close to the...
So this is the iconic U.S. Customs House built by Cass Gilbert. The statues in the front are made by Daniel Chester French, one of the most famous sculptors also in New York City. Gorgeous building. As I mentioned before, this was the fence, the oldest fence in all of New York City. The oldest fence probably all of America. And right here, it's pretty cut off. And you see most of them are actually cut off here, these ends of each chain of the fence. And that's because there used to be little crowns here. This was a royal park. In the middle of it was the statue of King George III. And during the Revolution, King George III was not a very popular person. So they destroyed that statue. And they also sawed off each of the tiny royal crowns right here. Now, according to legend, they smelted those metal crowns and used it to make it into cannonballs, which they shot at the British afterwards. Now, we don't know if that 100% is true. What we do know is that those crowns are no longer there. This is the Bowling Green 405 train station. There's also the Whitehall station on the RW, and there's a bunch of trains all around us. Also the one train to the South Ferry stop. Now we're heading to Stone Street, which is right around the corner. It's the oldest street in all of America. The city. Now this gets a lot more packed during the weekdays because this area is still very business office heavy. So you don't see that many people here in the weekends aside from tourists, more towards the very south of this area. So welcome to the oldest street in America. Well, this is Stone Street. It looks rather modern, doesn't it? Asphalt underneath our feet. Newer buildings, probably from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. What's up? Well, Stone Street was unfortunately cut off by this building directly in front of us, 85 Broad Street, which is the Goldman Sachs building. And 85 Broad Street replaced half of Stone Street, cutting it half in the middle and modernizing this part. Now, the interesting thing about the construction of 85 Broad Street is that it was built on the oldest street in all of America, which was originally paved by the Dutch, who called it Hoogstraat, which translates into High Street. And then shortly after that, it was renamed to Stone Street. Since 85 Broad Street was built on top of such amount of history, they found a bunch of artifacts during construction. It ended up being the most expensive archaeological dig in American history thus far, founding hundreds of artifacts from Dutch New Amsterdam, such as cigar rolling papers and books and many other things of that nature. Some of those artifacts you might see at the Museum of the City of New York. Now, how are we going to get through? Well, this huge building is in the way, but right around this building is the historic section. And now you kind of start seeing kind of the oddness of the financial district. There's a lot of buildings that are very new, a lot of buildings, like the Broad 85 Street is very new, but also buildings are Greek Revival style. They're dating back to the late 1800s, and the buildings that date back to 1836 and onwards, such as the rebuilding of Francis Tavern, which has been the tavern here ever since British New York, but it was rebuilt already 3 times, and this is a replica of the original Francis Tavern. And here we get to see really old New York. We start getting a sense of old New York. However, if you go to a city like Paris, even Boston, London, you'll see remnants from the 1600s and the 1700s, and also especially the early 1800s. But here you don't. All these buildings were built after 1835. However, there are still some remnants of old Dutch New York. Right here we see a well from Dutch New York. It was a well that was adjoined to the Lovelace Tavern. And here we see the Lovelace Tavern. And the Lovelace Tavern was a tavern from Dutch New Amsterdam, built by the Dutch. Now, tavern was a very multi-purpose building, and it wasn't just a place to drink, but also a place to do business and run the government. And this was the very foundations of the very first city hall. So 85 Broad Street was built right on top of one of the oldest parts of New York City that remained. So as I mentioned in Hidden History episode 5, a lot of this area of New York City burnt down in the Great Fire of 1835, including Stone Street. Now, the stones survive from Stone Street, so we will still be walking on the oldest street in all of New York City, one of the oldest streets in all of America. But the buildings surrounding it is definitely the older buildings of this area, but only date back to 1836. Right after the Great Fire of 1835, there was a huge effort to rebuild a lot of these buildings, and Stone Street was the first. And most of these buildings that we're going to walk across were built in 1836. So now let's walk on good New York City history. Now it's surrounded by a bunch of restaurants and bars, such as Dubliner, a burger restaurant here.
What do you want to do?
Great place for tourists. Great place even if you're a local and want to have a quick drink. During the springtime, we see a bunch of outdoor seating. Look above and see these buildings dating back to 1835, 36, I mean. Now, these restaurants weren't always here. This used to be not a very popular area because no one hung out here after 5:30. Very packed. So a Greek immigrant from Sparta came here in the 1950s, and he worked as a busboy in the nearby Delmonico's restaurant. This Spartan immigrant who worked his way up through the ranks of the restaurant industry ended up buying this street towards the late 1880s, early 1990s. As I said, no one wanted to come to this street after 5:30 or after 6 p.m. when work was done. This has always been traditionally, ever since the 1820s and 30s, was a place for offices and business. Very few residential apartments in this area. In the 1990s, no one really hung out here at night, making Stone Street one of the more shadier streets in New York City. Surrounded by such beautiful architecture, but by that time in the 1990s, it seemed kind of dilapidated and no one wanted to hang out here. There was no restaurants, just these old buildings that were pretty run down. So that smart immigrant bought the street and started opening up a few restaurants, including Harry's right here in front of the India House, which I'll show you right here, Harry's. And then he partnered up with an Irishman by the last name of McDonald and opened up Ulysses. And they had a great joke where they said, what if a Greek and an Irishman open up a bar? Well, you get a little bit of Homer, you get a little bit of James Joyce, you end up getting Ulysses. And they're referencing how Ulysses is based on a Homer epic poem. Now let's walk through here. And here we have Hanover Square, which is known as the India House. Underneath is Harry's, the very first restaurant built on Stone Street during the 90s. And India House, also a very, very old building, dating back to it was built in 1914. And there was probably a building here that looked very similar, built in 1836-37. And this is interesting coming to this area, seeing the mixture of these newer modern buildings from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and architecture from the mid-1800s. Nothing before then really remains except those two ruins that we saw earlier on this video, but at least there's some old New York still living here in the very southern tip of Manhattan, which was where New York City started and New Amsterdam started before then. So take a walk here when you can. Thank you everyone so much for tuning in. I'm Ariel with Urbanist. Keep being awesome and always keep on exploring. Have a great day, everyone.